Cool. Good evening, everybody. I hope that you are all well. Welcome to our December TBIF, our last TBIF for the year. We are really honored to have Dr. Nancy Cowardin to be our guest speaker this evening. So just to introduce our speaker, Dr. Nancy Cowardin has provided assessment and expert witness testimony in over 800 criminal cases and has served as a plaintiff's principal expert in several class action lawsuits, which now monitor disability accommodations for inmates and parolees in the California prison system. Dr. Cowardin has been honored as Educator of the Year by the California Learning Disability Association for training more than 3,500 justice system professionals in identifying and accommodating disabilities in victims, witnesses, and criminal defendants. So we are very honored to have Dr. Cowardin here with us. Thank you so much. And we look forward to your talk.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. I thought I was unmuted. Okay. Hi. Hi, everybody. I'm going to attempt to run this PowerPoint and do it right. But right now, I guess I need to introduce myself. I am a Buddhist, and I have been one for 14 years. I attend Hsi Fang Temple, where I'm a docent, and I teach. Sometimes I teach art to groups there. This work that I did for 30 years, or I began around 1990, I was not a Buddhist for the first half of that time. And becoming one changed my everything, my perspective on crime, punishment, and the prisoners themselves quite a bit, and my own work as well. I had been suffering a great deal of stress and felt very responsible for outcomes of the prisoners I worked with, trials and so forth, because a lot of the times the outcome was depending on me and the work that I did. But becoming a Buddhist changed a lot of that for me. And tonight, what I'd like to talk about is I wrote a book. Here's the book. The book is called Disorganized Crime. It's about disabilities in defendants, inmates, and victims. And I hope you can see this PowerPoint on your screen. This book is not written from a Buddhist perspective. It's straightforward. I wrote this book because I was retiring from my work, and I wanted to leave it behind as a legacy, as information for my lawyers. Originally, it was written for lawyers. However, I did specifically write it in a chatty style so that anybody could read it. And my editors, friends and other editors, were not lawyers, and they enjoyed the book. Having said that, I never expected to make any money on this book. I do sell it, but I will never break even, and it doesn't matter. I did it from my heart, and I wanted to get everything I knew down in one place, and that was the reason for this book. So I'll talk about that from a Buddhist perspective tonight, which is what makes it different than if I were talking to a group of lawyers or even just a group at the library. I would not use this perspective. But because I know many of you, and by the way, I gave a talk that was preliminary to this in the summer of 2019 at Hsi Fang Temple. And at that time, the book was about to be edited and get ready for publication. And you all asked me to come back when it was published. I got it edited during the fall of 2019, and the book came out in January of 2020, just in time for COVID. And I had the book out, and I attended a number of talks January, February, and very beginning of March, and we went into complete shutdown. And I don't even remember what the book says now, basically. But anyway, we've been, completely stagnant. But the point is, I was speaking at a lawyer conference in San Diego. I stopped to see Venerable and stayed overnight at Hsi Fang before driving back. And I did leave some books with her, so she has them. If anybody's interested, she'll do a drive-by. Anyway, I wanted to then begin to talk about this. I want to introduce you to someone. So this is Tony. I made him up, but he represents a lot of the people that I met. So take a look at Tony's face. He's sad. He's alone. He's terrified. He's away from his family. and he's looking at you. He's sitting across the table from you. And you feel his anxiety and his despair. Tony could have been something. He had a life going. And it seems to be interrupted, if not completely derailed now. You look at him and you feel, you as Buddhists feel a certain compassion for this young man. He's every young man. He's mixed racial. He's in his early 20s into late 20s. And as you begin to talk to him, you understand his experience as a kid growing up in a ghetto somewhere, probably from a single parent home. He did very poorly at school. They may or may not have discovered that he had some sort of learning disability, but we'll get to that in a minute. So he did badly everywhere. His neighborhood was infested with gangs and drugs, and he had very little future. And now I hope you're feeling a little bit of compassion for Tony before I add one more piece of information. Tony's accused of committing a brutal murder, and you know what? He probably did it. If that changes your opinion of Tony, I know you, it doesn't, but this is what many people see. As soon as I say that, Tony is a monster. So what I'd like to point out is that the prisoners and people that I met are not this. They're not monsters. They are ordinary, complex beings who are part of a larger human symphony. And that symphony includes all the fears, hopes, desires, of every person. So what's one more thing about them? The prisoners that I worked with had disabilities, cognitive disabilities that affected thinking, learning, understanding, and sometimes communication. And these three school-based disabilities included what we used to call mental retardation, and I may lapse and say that from time to time tonight. We call it today intellectual disability. It's the same thing. Specific learning disability and attention deficit disorder. And just to differentiate that, I think we all know what an intellectual disability is. It's a reduced IQ, and the mental ages that go along with that are also younger. So it's like dealing with a younger person who may or may not be cognitively mature enough to understand what they did was wrong, or their part in the outcome. A specific learning disability is completely different. This is a person whose IQ is normal, low average, average, or even well above average, but has problems learning a specific thing like reading or math, or both of those things. There's no there's no IQ difference that explains the inability to learn. It just is there. And this was a group that I taught. I've taught both groups as a teacher in the public schools. These were, for me, the most fun to work with. They're very cool group of kids. And then I think we know what an attention deficit disorder is, or we have an idea. By itself, it may or may not be disabling, but when you combine it with a specific learning disability, it can be. And so this combination of disorders, with it comes the cognitive disorganization and the immature decision-making, linear thinking of a younger person, poor adaptability under stress, and in this case, poor self-advocacy skills. So if you think about this, these are people who may decide to commit a crime or may be talked into committing a crime by friends who are much more intelligent and use them. Often they're used by gangs. They make terrific patsies for gang members. But then when they're caught, they're unable to advocate for themselves at the police station. And can you see that? What it says here is in school and social settings. So a lot of people think that having a learning disability stops once you leave this classroom. Well, it doesn't. Having a learning disability or any of these disorders goes right out into your life and stays with you as you grow up. The smarter people are, the better they can overcome those things and become successful. But the clients that I saw generally could not. So anyway, that sets the groundwork for you as to who I dealt with. If a lawyer called me and asked me to assess his prisoner in jail or in prison, I would usually find out, why are you calling me? Why would you think I could help you? there should have been some reason in the person's background that indicates that they would fall into one of these categories. Then I would take the case. All right. So having done this for years as a non-Buddhist and then becoming a Buddhist in the middle of it, I became aware that there were certain concepts that pertained here. And I'd like to just go through them and offer one case study that's in the book for each of these. The first thing is intent versus outcome. You know, in Buddhism and many other religions, Catholic religion as well, it's your intention that counts. And if you happen to cause a problem or commit a crime but your intention was something else, under your religion, you're basically forgiven. You meant well, but not under the law. And this is very important when we talk about someone with reduced cognitive capability, whom, let's say, okay, here was a young man I actually had. He was originally thinking of helping this old lady across the street. However, he suddenly realized she had a purse on her arm and maybe he could just take that on the way. His intent was a purse snatching. However, he managed to grab it in such a way that the woman fell down and hit her head on the sidewalk. 2 months later, she died of complications of that. He was suddenly he was being accused now of murder or an unintentional murder. That was never his intention, but that was the outcome. And under the law, that is what he was responsible for. Okay. Next one would be dependent origination. And we all know what that is. It's a coming together of all the factors that create something, the creation, and then the breakdown, like creating a thing, like a table or something. But when I think of dependent origination, I think of the client himself, and I will give you a good case study example on this. How did he come to be who he is, genetically and in terms of his environment and education and his parental teaching and experience? So that makes the person who he now is, who's now before a jury. The next is causes and conditions. And here I usually refer to the crime itself. Most crimes don't happen because one person did one thing. It's like everything else. All of these factors came together and this outcome happened. This client's action is one factor in a continuum of everything that occurred. And then the last is a set of things: compassion, fundamental fairness. That's a legal term, but it pertains to us too. Impermanence, karma, samsara. If I get to those, great. If we run out of time, we'll see. But I wanted you to think about these particular factors when I put this cartoon on. This is a kind of a good example of a lot of these things. My example is Igor. This cartoon, in case it's too blurry for you, it says here, convinced by his buddies that in actual fact they were only grave borrowing, a young Igor starts on his road to crime. You can see Igor is in the hole digging for his friends. They're standing out there drinking beer, looking around to see who's watching. When the police drive up, who will still be there? Igor will still be in that hole digging because he got duped into it by these so-called friends. How many cases did I have that were just like this? In fact, before I even went into forensic work, I was a high school teacher, and I had a kid in my resource group. He was there because he had a specific learning disability in math. Nicest kid, great kid, named Gilbert. He didn't have a lot of friends in the regular program, and when he was invited to go joyriding down in Laguna Beach, he went with these guys. When they got to Laguna Beach, remember this is years ago, the city had just installed parking meters on the street. And they were griping and carrying on. Look at this city is so cheap, and they put parking meters in, and they're so cheap, they want to collect money from us. And gee, I wonder how much they make on a weekend in these meters. And gee, I wonder how much they make in 1 meter. Why don't we take this meter off and check it out? So, of course, Gilbert jumps right into this, and he's got the screwdriver working the parking meter off the pole. And at that moment, someone must have called the police. This was before cell phones. Here come the police over the hill, and Gilbert has a success and failure moment at once. He gets the parking meter off the pole, and the police arrive. Oh, so it's like, yay, oh, at once. Naturally, where are his friends at this point? Long gone. And the only person who ends up sitting in the police station at 2 o'clock in the morning with his parents called to come get him is Gilbert. Now, how does Gilbert react? Not well. He has very poor self-advocacy skills. He won't rat on his friends, of course. That would be a big problem. So instead, he gets belligerent. You know, I thought about this so many times. If Gilbert had been smart, because he was a cool kid, what he should have said is, oh, look, officer, good thing you came. This just came off the pole. He probably would have gotten away with it because he was cute. But no, because kids with LD don't always act the way we think they should. So anyway, this Igor cartoon for me always makes me think of Gilbert, as well as a number of other of my clients who got roped into doing something to get in with a gang, with friends. So with that, let's go through one case for each of those 4 items. And let's talk about intent versus outcome. And to do that, I want to talk about James. Uh-oh. Can you see that? I hope you can see the picture in the lower screen. I can't because there's something in front of it, but okay. James was a 36-year-old man with learning and attention disorders. To picture him, he is a very large person, well over 6 feet, weighing well over 300 pounds. He had learning disabilities and attention disorders. He lived behind his brother's house in a kind of a garage studio apartment. His brother was a plumber and had a plumber's truck parked in the driveway. James has brute strength. He's very strong. And so every now and then his brother would ask him to assist with a plumbing job because he could rip a sink off a wall or pull a toilet out in one pull. And so he was aware of some of the plumbing jobs. This particular day, he went with his brother to the home of a single woman, a teacher, and they were redoing one of the bathrooms, or the bathroom in her house. His job was to rip out the toilet. He noticed that she lived alone. When they went home, he also noticed that his brother kept keys from all the houses of the jobs he was working on little hooks inside his truck, his plumbing truck. And he was not scheduled to work on that woman's house the next day. So James devised a plan. And his plan was to return to the home and burglarize it while she was teaching. To do this, he got up early and he got her key from his brother's truck. And then he didn't drive, but he got on his bicycle. And he took some trash bags with him because he was going to go in when she was gone, begin to burglarize the place, fill some bags with her stuff, and drive the bike home. And I hope if you can see the man in the lower corner, he's got about 4 bags filled with stuff on his bike. So how many bags do you think a person should take with them to someone's house to steal their things if they're riding a bike? How does 14 sound? Because that's what he brings. How in the world he thought he would get 14 bags home, I have no idea. But this is what he does. He goes to her home. He lets himself in and he begins taking things. Now, this is where the attention deficit disorder begins to kick in and the learning disability. He begins perseverating. It means getting stuck in a routine and not getting out of it. And what he was perseverating on was taking and putting things in bags, which he piled up by the kitchen door. He had at least 5 full of stuff before the ultimate happened. The things he was taking, though, had no rhyme nor reason. Cat toys, potpourri, a harmonica, and a radio, and things that you could sell or that were worth money. But literally stuff, just stuff. And what do you suppose happens? Perseveration. He gets lost in the task, he loses time, and of course the woman comes home. Now, this is a house like many in the Los Angeles area where there's a center hall and rooms off to the side. The woman entered the front in the center hall and right away could see that something was wrong. There were things dropped in the hallway. The kitchen was there to the left and it had bags piled up. And she, started to make, oh my gosh, what's going on? That kind of noise. he realized what had happened, that she was home, and she was standing in the only exit, the hallway out. And so he did the only thing he could think of. He ran her over, knocked her down in order to try to get out of the house. But when his 300-pound weight fell on the woman, he crushed her larynx, and she was dying on the floor. And he took a heavy object and hit her because he wanted to knock her out, put her out of her misery. The intention here had been to burglarize, but the escape causes the death of the owner. Intent versus outcome. I have to tell you that this man was Lenny. He was a gentle giant. He had never hurt a fly. He was so upset with this that he wandered aimlessly for days. The police caught up with him very quickly. 2-3 days later, he still had her harmonica in his pocket. He easily confessed, and he sat, I saw his arrest video, he sat rocking, saying, "Just kill me, just kill me." It was just so out of character for him. Originally, they were seeking the death penalty on James, but after my report, and then they looked at other paperwork, they decided to forego that and just go with, a life in prison sentence. And that was the outcome. But when I think of intent versus outcome, I often think of James. So that's item one. The next point and case would be basically dependent origination. And in this case, I'm thinking of a woman in New York named Tina. This picture is not Tina. I took it off the line. I couldn't give you their real pictures. But she is a woman, 36-year-old woman with genetic and familial disabilities. In other words, she has mental retardation, or what we now call intellectual disability, she came by genetically because her family is so intermarried. We are talking about people who married their close relatives and created genetic anomalies. So she is high functioning. She was able to attend school in the New York system for disabilities, and as a teenager went to a high school in Manhattan that was it's called a vocational school. It was for people with disabilities. Her cousin went with her, and the teachers from the school taught them how to use the subway so they could go that many stops, get off, and go to the school. And they both learned it. Her two brothers were so impaired that they could not attend the school. They were much lower functioning than she was. I'm not sure the relationship between her mother and father, but they were obviously close genetically, and all the kids were disabled. Tina marries her cousin, Mike, and actually, we don't know for sure that Mike was her cousin. He could have been her half-brother because of the intermarriage situation in the family. And they produced two daughters who are both intellectually disabled. So if you get the picture now, here they are living in a project in Brooklyn. Tina, her husband, the two girls, the mother-in-law, who's her aunt, and his mother. And then they meet a friend at their high school named Cal, who has a little boy. Cal doesn't live there, but he often leaves the little boy there with her, and she sort of adopts him as another child. And they have an apartment that's too small for that many people, and she's a hoarder on top of it. And so there are actually paths through the stuff into the apartment, and it's piled up on the sides. Of course, you can imagine that before long, they have two dogs too. So there's fleas, there's cockroaches, there's mice and whatnot to get into the apartment. And soon those vermin begin to spill out to other apartments nearby, and people call the Board of Health, and they send someone out to the apartment, and it's terrible. I mean, it's infested with everything. And they tell her, okay, we're taking the kids away because this isn't a safe environment for them. And when you clean this place up, we'll get them back to you. And so she does. Boy, she wants those kids back. She goes out and buys, 5-gallon containers of industrial strength bug cleaner and just floods the place. She kills everything. It must have been an extremely unhealthy environment. But the bugs were gone, and they returned the children. But at the same time, they realized that this is a family in need of some help. So they got a home health care worker to come to her house every day, 5 days a week, to assist with a little housework, a little shopping, a little cooking, mostly though to look after the kids and help them with their homework when they got home from school. So this was working pretty well for a while. So let me say this. Tina's skills then were going to be improved in terms of health, safety, and domestic tasks. Now, the issue here comes up related to her girls and the little boy who was staying with her. Tina's 2 brothers, her husband, and their friend Cal are all beginning to abuse the girls, sexually abuse the girls. And Tina is very unsure about A, what the boundaries are, and B, what to do about it. As a woman with mental retardation who lives with so many people, it was very difficult for her. She was confused herself about these roles. Having been impregnated by her own father when she was 14, that baby died before it was 1 year old because it was so disabled. But she's aware on every level that this is wrong. And so she does everything she can to stop this from happening. She hits them with a broom. She locks them in the bathroom. She locks the girls in the bedroom with their grandmother. I can't tell you, there was quite a list of things that she did to try to save the girls. And yet, what happened eventually was that home healthcare worker who was coming to live with them every afternoon and assist the girls, the little boy told her enough that the healthcare worker became concerned that something was going on and reported it as she had to. And the police became involved. And yes, indeed, Tina began to talk to them because she was so concerned for her girls. The men were all sentenced and went to prison. Tina was accused of failure to prevent the molestation of her children. And in other words, child endangerment. When I met her, I went to the Brooklyn, one of the jails there, and she was just in tears. She wanted those girls back so badly, and they were nice little girls, about 14 and 10, I think, 11 at the time. They were at that point in an orphanage on Long Island, and she was very cooperative because she wanted this. In the end, our report and testimony ended up with her cooperating and not going to prison. She was sent to a sort of a mental hospital in upstate New York for a rehabilitation experience, which all it really meant was that she was learning, better skills as a parent and so forth. But when she got back, her family was gone. The men were all in prison. Her mother and mother-in-law, they were furious with her because all the men went away and it was her fault. And the girls stayed in the orphanage because the city never intended to give her back her kids until they were 18. And so, what I said in this chapter was basically, winning was still losing for her. I mean, she did not go to prison, and I felt that was right. This is a woman who did her best, but it just wasn't good enough. But again, when I think of dependent origination, I just think of the person herself and what she became and how that happened. So that is the story of Tina. Let me get my book. Causes and conditions. When I think about causes and conditions and I think about crime, one person immediately comes to mind, and that would be JR, a young man in Louisiana. He was probably my favorite case because of the wonderful outcome. So let me tell you his story. He was born to a deaf mother, a single parent. She had no language and so never spoke words to him, only did rudimentary sign language. She didn't even know that he could go to kindergarten, and so he didn't. He didn't start school till first grade, and he walked in with almost no language, just, very, very rudimentary. Right away, the school realized that he needed help, and so they put him in speech therapy. He was getting help there, but he also was discovered to have a learning disability. He just wasn't picking up the academics. So now we had a compound learning and language disorder, and later an attention disorder as well. But He went through school for a number of years. His skill developed to about a 4th grade level here and there, and that's about it. He continued to stagnate at that level, and by the time he was in high school, it was a bad experience for him, and he just dropped out. So now he's this young man hanging out the streets of Baton Rouge with nothing much to do. He befriends someone who is able to get him a gun, and he decides that he's going to commit a robbery and make some money. So, who would he rob? Let's see. This truck here is a good representation of the person he picked, who was sitting in this kind of truck with the sideboards on it. You see that red truck? A kind of truck he had never seen with those running boards. It was a workman. He was having his lunch at a convenience store on a busy street in Baton Rouge, sitting in his truck. And this is who he chooses to rob, a man with probably not much more than 20 bucks on himself. But he goes over and stands on the running board. And then he doesn't know what to do because he hasn't planned it at all. Planning is an issue for my clients very often. And adaptability, because once things don't work, they can't seem to undo the problem and they keep forging ahead. So he asks the man for a cigarette. The man gives it to him. And he doesn't have a lighter because he doesn't really smoke. So then he has to ask him for a match. And about this time, the man starts to realize, hey, wait a minute, there's something here. There's something wrong here. And at that point, JR takes out the gun and says, give me all your money. And a terrible thing happens. Those running boards, it was a little wet. He slips off and he starts to fall. The gun goes off and literally, totally accidentally shoots this man and kills him right there. It was not intended, but this was what happened. Talk about causes and conditions. Those running boards were part of it. Well, there he's caught easily. This case goes before an all-white jury, and within moments, he has a death penalty verdict and is sent to the Angola prison in Louisiana. I begin the book with this case, actually, chapter 1, because it was kind of an eye-opener for me. I sat in the hallway of Angola waiting to be admitted to death row to talk to this young man. By the way, this was 8 years after the actual murder. He was now 26 years old, and a very different person emerged from the one that committed this crime, but I'll get to that. And I'm sitting in the hallway, and there's like a poster with little snapshots of all the men on death row there. And as I looked at them, I realized that out of the 100 or so men, at least 95 of them were Black. And so I thought, wow, I'm in the South. I don't know, it was an eye-opener for me. Okay, while on death row, JR participated in 8 years of what I call self-study. He was working very hard. He had a schedule for himself that you wouldn't believe, 6 hours of study per day, because he was all alone. He had nothing else to do. He actually got his GED, high school diploma, and completed 1 year of junior college. He could read very well. All his skills were upgraded. At this point, we arranged to have a retrial because none of the learning disability information had been brought in during his first trial. And his lawyer just didn't know how to present that. And he just went straight to prison. So the appeals trial occurred in Baton Rouge. We had a wonderful judge. This wasn't a jury issue, it was a judge trial. And he allowed me to not only testify, but to show a PowerPoint that explained learning disabilities and the interference with social learning and so forth. And the death verdict, eventually it was discussed between everybody. It was overturned. And the great news about this was that JR walked off death row for the first time in 8 years into the general population. He will never go home, but the warden at Angola was so impressed with this young man's self-improvement program that he made him a GED tutor at the prison, which means that he's now a teacher of others. And he has status, he has protection, he gets respect. And so his life has changed completely. It's not a great life, he's still in prison, but it's sure a heck of a lot better than sitting on death row. So that's my JR story. And then finally, compassion. For this case, I wanted to introduce you to Ronnie. Ronnie was a 25-year-old man with long-standing intellectual disability. He had been in the classes for kids with mental retardation since he was a preschooler. He had very poor skills. He had two horrible brothers who were gangbangers who taunted him, called him ugly and stupid, told him he'd never get a girlfriend. And they were very crude, if you could read about this. But in any case, he wanted to know a girl. And one day he noticed a young woman who got off a bus. And he started hanging around the bus stop to see, and she would get, every day she would get off the bus, and he tried to befriend her. She didn't really pay attention. He said hello. Finally, he started to kind of follow her to see, where does she live? Maybe he could visit her. And he does find where she lives. He decides one night to visit her. When he gets to her apartment, there's a patio in the back, and he goes to the door. The lights are out. Apparently, the kids are, she has two kids. She's a single parent. They must be asleep. But the door to the patio is ajar or broken, and in any case, he enters. So this was a visit to visit this woman. Once he gets in there, I won't go into this whole thing, but it ends up being an assault, and he ends up murdering her. Okay, so I wanted to talk about compassion here from a little different perspective. I was called to testify in the second part of this trial, which is the penalty trial. The way this works is the first jury trial determines whether he's guilty or not, and he was guilty. The second was to determine whether he should get the death penalty. And this case happened in the early 90s, well before the Supreme Court determined that people with mental retardation could not be executed. That happened later. So it was under consideration. I testified as to his disabilities for a grueling 3-hour period. They really wanted the death penalty on this man. After me, interestingly, they brought in a neuropsychologist who testified for 10 minutes and said that Ronnie's brain was, quote, shrinking. And that's all they needed. That was it. The jury bought the whole thing because it was true. And in the end, they agreed with me, and they gave him life in prison rather than the death penalty. But
Nancy, sorry to interrupt you, just giving you your 10 minutes.
Thank you, and perfect timing, thank you. So okay. It is perfect timing because this is what I wanted you to hear. There had been a reporter in the courtroom each day, and she was very biased against Ronnie, and I would say most of the headlines in the evening would be negative. She stayed long enough to hear the determination that he would be given a life sentence. And then she raced out of the courtroom to write her daily report. But I want to read you what it says in the book next about compassion. This is tough for me to read. I'm going to try. It says, Ronnie was indeed found guilty of the rape and murder, but in the penalty phase of the trial, the jury awarded a life sentence instead of the death penalty. Questioned about their unanimous decision, their comments mirrored the statements I had presented regarding Ronnie's reduced mental capacity and his pitiful prior life experiences. The reporter rushed out of the courtroom to write her nightly synopsis, but here's what she didn't see. Ronnie's mother and the mother of the victim were both present in the courtroom when the verdicts were read. After the smoke cleared and people started leaving, both of these lovely Hispanic women came together in a tearful hug. They expressed sorrow for each other's grief. One had lost her daughter to murder. The other now lost her son to a life in prison. It didn't matter to them. Loss was loss. This true and generous human story was never put into print till now, but I still think about it whenever I contemplate the meaning of compassion. Wow, you know, I wasn't present, of course, but the lawyers told me about this later. Wow, I mean, I just can't, I can't even imagine it, but that's compassion. So that's my four elements. And I want to say a couple other things. When I talk to a jury, the overriding issue for me is fundamental fairness. Yes, people should be punished for their crimes. And yes, we should consider the pain of the victims and their families. Absolutely. But before we make those determinations, we need to know the whole person, because we're all more than the worst thing we've ever done. And this is a person who came together from many experiences and participated in many life things, had a lot of factors and causes and conditions that contributed. As long as a jury knows all of those things, and then they make a determination, I can live with that outcome. So that's what juries need to know. The clients themselves, the inmates, on occasion and very rarely, I had a chance to apply active compassion. In other words, I might assist them by calling a family member for them, or saying that he's doing well, or intervening with the placement people in the prison system to make sure that he was put in one of our designated prisons. Sometimes I could talk a little bit about impermanence. There will be a parole. You will have a life after this. And although I never talked about meditation, there are groups that do go to prisons and teach meditation to prisoners. This really has helped them in many states, California certainly, but Alabama had a wonderful meditation, of all places, a great meditation program that changed the lives of prisoners and made them much more capable of behaving and then thinking on their own crimes, and they became more remorseful, better, easier to release. So these are client considerations. And then finally, for ourselves, professionals, we have to consider self-compassion, which is what Venerable J. Wade talked about last week. We have to apply that to ourselves. But I also like to think of karma and samsara when I think about the fact that, you know, they did do this. I didn't. And yes, there will be an outcome that they've caused. But this self-compassion comes in when you know, I knew, for example, I had 6 cases in Oklahoma where I had to test 6 men on death row. If they qualified as having intellectual disability, they were exempt from the death penalty. In the end, 2 were removed from death row for other reasons, 2 because they qualified, and 2 I had to not qualify. That's tough, because I knew that writing that report, there was nothing preventing them carrying out the execution, and it would be soon, and it was. How do you live with yourself there? I can't lie for a lot of reasons, and I wouldn't ever in a report, but it is hard, and that's where self-compassion comes in. We have to help ourselves. So I guess that's kind of what I wanted to say. I have little lotuses popping in. Amitofo. Now, I do want to talk this book. If you are interested, please don't buy this book, but unless you really want it. Venerable has some in San Diego. They're $20. She can give you one. If you are not in San Diego, I can mail you a book. I will pay the tax. I will pay the mailing. All you have to do is contact me and I'll mail it to you. But like I said, this was never a money-making venture. If you're interested, I have 22 chapters, I think, here, and each one most of these are individual cases or a set of cases related to one disability. But in the book, there's more than 40 individuals who are discussed, some in depth, like the JR case and the Tina case. Those are foundational chapters. So that's what I have to say. And I finished on time. And if there are questions, we can have those.
Thank you so much, Nancy. That was really moving and really powerful talk.
Yay.
Perfect.
Okay. Great. Oh, this is much better.
So you've got some comments in the chat and also a question. So Denny and Leslie said, magnificent and outstanding talk. Love that you finished with compassion. Thank you for your humane work and your Buddhist path. And then there's a question from Tom, who's asking, there's a woman to be executed by the federal government. She was horribly abused as a child by her mother and others. And we wonder if she would be considered as having some sort of disability so that she does not have to be executed.
The only disability that would prevent her from the execution would be an intellectual disability, formal classification as having mental retardation. She doesn't probably have that. It could be tested, but this is what happened in Oklahoma as well. They basically asked me to test a number of people on death row to just see. And in the end, I mean, obviously they screened them ahead of time and a few of them did qualify. But this woman, if she's never been tested that way before, it's unlikely that she'll qualify now. It's a sad story, and it's a typical one of prisoners. They do have bad backgrounds that are abusive, and all of that should be presented to a jury at trial. If it hasn't been, there's a way to appeal for a new trial that does bring that stuff up in the courtroom and maybe would make a difference. That's what happened with JR. The appeal resulted in an overturn of the verdict.
Thank you. And then we have a question from Carl.
Hi. I just had a brief question. I'm not very good at typing, so I'll just tell you vocally. It would appear on the surface that the fundamental teachings of Buddhism are not really compatible on the surface with the criminal justice system as a whole. For example, Buddhism does not permit free will. There's no concept of free will in Buddhism. So everything is causes and conditions. And we don't really have the freedom to make choices in a strict interpretation of that kind of Buddhist concept. At the same time, Buddhism teaches there's no enduring self. There's no Buddha, no soul, no enduring self. And prison terms and prosecution in general seems to be based on the assumption that there is. So I'm trying to understand how criminal justice as a whole can fit in with Buddhist teachings, or do we have to sort of make some compromises?
Gosh, wow. Well, you're talking about a system that's difficult to penetrate. I actually was one of the experts on a bunch of class action lawsuits in this state against the prison and parole system for not accommodating disabilities. This is a tough group. They don't really care what's wrong with you. It's what you did that counts. That's what they're looking at. So after they lost the lawsuits, the parole system was mandated to train their parole commissioners to look at disabilities. And you know, anyway, what did they do was they hired me because I was the expert against them. And it was actually kind of a smart move to hire me to train their people. They kind of put a guy on me. I don't want to say his name, but one of the commissioners was supposed to keep me in line and make sure I didn't do anything really crazy. And so we wrote a lot of materials and put together a giant handbook. And then I went up to Sacramento and trained them for 2.5 days. But this guy, his name was Doug, he told me that afterward, he was a parole commissioner, and his jail that he usually did these in was the one right here in LA, the LA County Jail, which is big. He said he was at a parole hearing following the training, and a guy came in wearing the jumpsuit colors they wear there to tell you what's wrong with them. He had on a yellow, which meant that he had some mental issues. And so Doug started talking to him, and the man was sitting there saying, And then Doug said, "Did you understand what I just said to you?" And the man said, yeah. And he said, "Well, then tell me what it was." The man couldn't tell him because he didn't get it. And Doug realized it, and he stopped the parole hearing and appointed an attorney. That is what I call one person gets it. And how long did it take me working with Doug for weeks and weeks, putting together our handbook and working together for him to see that light? I mean, I have no idea how you get a whole system to change, but court-ordered trainings and things like that can only help. That's all. Only way I can answer you. Look, I read novels all the time, and a lot of them are police novels and so forth, and I know how they think. Breaking into that, it's very difficult. They toe a hard line. And that they have to. That's their job. So somehow we have to penetrate that and teach them how to be a little bit more, have a bigger view a whole person, and be more compassionate. And that's what we tried to do. I trained 3,500 people in the system over a long period of time. And I think we made a real good headway with those people. But that was just a small number compared to the number that really need it. So great question.
Oh, thank you.
Answer.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then we have a question from Marissa, who is slightly different, away from prisons, but asking, just thinking about the current virtual learning situation with kids and what would be the best way forward in terms of supporting them.
Oh boy, that is the question. You know what, I've been thinking about this a lot. My son's significant other is a teacher, and she teaches, of all things, art this way. Imagine trying to teach art to a junior high kids this way. She's doing it. And it didn't occur to me until I thought about it a while. The people who are having the hardest time with this, that's the special ed teachers. And at least one of you here is a special ed teacher, I think. We've talked in the past. This is very difficult to do with kids who have problems learning and with technology in the first place. The ones who are having the most trouble with virtual learning seem to be this group. So listen, I can barely run this program myself, and I have a PhD. I can only imagine how tough it is for these people. So I don't know how to answer that question. Hopefully there will be improvements, and COVID will end, and we will all go back to school, and that's going to help a lot. But
thank you, Nancy.
And questions I can.
Yeah. One maybe last question from Keely, who says, what a compelling talk. Thank you so much for your wisdom and stories. I will definitely get your book, and I empathize with your relationship to your clients. I'm currently in graduate school to perhaps become a prison librarian, and I was wondering if you had any advice for how prison libraries can better serve and advocate for their populations. And Keely might want to get in touch with you later as well, but I don't know if you had any quick thoughts about that.
Oh gosh, I sure do. I've been to jails and prisons, all have libraries, and the librarian can be a very key person. In fact, I have a very dear friend whose daughter is a librarian at Rikers Island, the worst jail in America, in my opinion, in the women's portion. What a savior. She's put together some kind of a book cart that she can take to cells to try to, or she did before COVID, and help the prisoners. But what I found is that prisoners who can read, and that's about, let me give you the statistics here, about 1/3 can read well enough to read adult materials. Another third are functionally at the border of becoming literate, maybe 5th, 6th grade skills, and 1/3 can't read. They're illiterate of prisoners. So those who can seek out the library, in particular, the law library at the prisons, but they still need help. And the prison librarians can help them tremendously. Having said that, I have run into a couple of cases during our lawsuits where the librarians were afraid to help the men because they knew that the prison was under scrutiny legally, and they told them, sorry, I can't help you. And that was really terrible because they need the help, you know. So I have a lot of thoughts about librarians, and many of my friends are librarians. And I just see this as it's just a wonderful way to give something to do to prisoners, but also to assist them in their own appeals. I don't know if you know this also. You can send books to prisoners, you can send books, but they have to come directly from the printer, not from you. And so, you know, if there's a way, there's organizations like Friends Outside, things like that, who try to outfit the libraries in prisons so that people can read and have things to do. So you can look into that.
Thank you so much, Nancy, for this amazing talk, and for everybody listening as well, and these wonderful comments and questions. Venerable, would you like to say a few words?
Thank you. Thank you, Nancy, again, for spending time in your wisdom and sharing with us all the real life cases of how, like, we as a Buddhist, we apply what we learn in our life as well as in our professions. Yeah. So I believe that many of us really benefit, like seeing compassion in action and seeing what we learn from the Buddha's teachings, applying in our everyday life. Yeah. So thank you again.